Eastern Front, September 1943. A cold drizzle, persistent since just after 0400 hours, coated the trenches and the shattered remains of what had once been a small farming village. The usual pre-dawn cacophony of distant engines, the grinding of treads on frozen earth, and the guttural shouts of German tank commanders was conspicuously absent. This silence, rather than offering solace, bred a creeping unease among the Soviet infantrymen of the 308th Rifle Division, who had braced for the customary mechanized assault at first light. Senior Sergeant Ivan Volkov, a veteran of Stalingrad and Kursk, squinted through the periscope of his forward observation post, its lens smeared with condensation. He had witnessed the meticulous, almost ritualistic preparations of the Wehrmacht's armored formations countless times, a predictable prelude to their devastating thrusts. The absence of this familiar prelude, the expected roar of Maybach engines, was not a reprieve, but a deviation from a known, brutal script, suggesting a new and potentially more dangerous act was about to begin. His men, huddled in their dugouts, exchanged nervous jokes about the German panzers perhaps having run out of fuel, a gallows humor born of constant exposure to overwhelming force. They spoke of the predictable surge, the rhythmic clatter of tracks, the distinct whine of a tiger's powertrain, all sounds that usually announced their impending struggle for survival. This morning, however, the only sound was the drip of water from the sandbag parapet and the distant, sporadic crackle of small arms fire from the flanks. Volkov's experience told him that such an anomaly was never benign. The German war machine, though battered, remained a force of methodical precision. A delay, particularly one unaccompanied by the usual auditory signatures of a massing armor attack, indicated either a fundamental shift in tactics or the deployment of an entirely new, uncatalogued threat. He pulled back from the periscope, the cold metal pressing against his brow, and reached for the field telephone, the silence outside amplifying the faint static in the receiver. The customary pattern of engagement involved a softening artillery barrage, followed by the audible approach of tanks, their presence announced by a rising mechanical thunder that carried for kilometers across the flat, open terrain. This morning offered only an unnatural quiet, a void where the sounds of war should have been, a quiet that promised a different kind of terror. The stakes were clear. Misinterpreting this silence could mean the swift collapse of their entire sector. The acrid scent of burning oil and chemicals now dominated the battlefield, a thick, choking pall that erased the sun. This was no accidental conflagration. The smoke, a deliberate tactical choice, billowed from dozens of strategically placed canisters, each disgorging its opaque contents into the stagnant morning air. The traditional role of such a screen was clear: to obscure, to confuse, to offer a momentary blindness to the enemy, allowing for either a clandestine withdrawal or a concealed advance of infantry. These particular smoke generators, primarily the MDSH and the larger TD3 models, contained a mixture of sulfur trioxide and chlorosulfonic acid, producing a dense, persistent white cloud upon exposure to atmospheric moisture. The MDSH, a cylindrical canister weighing approximately 12 kilograms, could generate a screen 100 meters long and 10 meters high for up to 6 minutes, while the TD3, a truck-mounted system, offered a significantly greater, though less mobile, output. Their deployment here, however, seemed to defy conventional doctrine, as no immediate infantry charge followed, nor was there any sign of a retreat from the Soviet lines. Instead, the smoke settled, a shimmering, impenetrable wall that swallowed the familiar landscape. Visibility dropped to mere meters, rendering optical sights and even the naked eye utterly useless beyond the immediate foreground. German forward observers, peering through their rangefinders and periscopes, reported only a featureless, swirling void where Soviet positions had been moments before. The sudden sensory deprivation was disorienting, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, fostering uncertainty and a sense of isolation among the defenders. Production logs from the Krasny Oktyabr factory indicated a surge in MDSH canister output during the preceding month, with daily quotas reaching 3,000 units, a threefold increase over peacetime levels. This quantitative shift suggested a planned, large-scale deployment, far exceeding the requirements for localized screening operations. The sheer volume of smoke generators deployed here spoke not of a minor tactical maneuver, but of an intent to create an environment of profound and prolonged obscurity across a significant sector of the front. The strategic implication of such a dense and enduring screen was manifold. It nullified the German advantage in air reconnaissance and observation, effectively blinding their artillery spotters and preventing accurate counter-battery fire. Furthermore, it disrupted their command and control, as communications reliant on visual cues or line-of-sight signaling became impossible. This deliberate act of environmental manipulation transformed the battlefield into a void, a canvas upon which a new, unseen threat could be painted. The acrid haze, a mixture of cordite and burning timber, began to thin, not dissipating entirely, but rather shifting, swirling in the faint pre-dawn breeze. Through this veil, the Soviet infantry, their laughter still echoing faintly from the recent jests about delayed German attacks, observed a new, unsettling phenomenon. Shapes, indistinct at first, resolved themselves into the unmistakable silhouettes of armored vehicles, emerging with a spectral quietude that defied their mass. No clanking of tracks, no roar of engines preceded their appearance. The accustomed cacophony of a tank assault, the grinding gears and straining diesels that typically announced the panzers, was conspicuously absent. Instead, these steel behemoths glided forward, their presence registered more by the displacement of the smoke itself than by any auditory cue. This unnerving silence was the first indication that the engagement had shifted beyond the familiar. A detailed analysis of later captured vehicles and interrogation files from the 2nd Panzer Division confirmed the tactical innovation. German engineers, under pressure to overcome the acoustic signatures that betrayed their armor, had implemented a series of modifications. These included the widespread adoption of rubber-padded track shoes, replacing the traditional all-steel links, and the meticulous re-engineering of exhaust systems to dampen engine noise. Production logs from the Henschel and MAN factories indicated that by late 1943, approximately 60% of new Tiger I and Panther D models incorporated these sound reduction measures. The strategic implication of this silent approach was profound. It negated the Soviet doctrine of early warning, which relied heavily on acoustic detection of approaching armor. Previously, the rumble of a panzer formation could be heard at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers in open terrain, providing precious minutes for anti-tank gunners to prepare their positions or for infantry to deploy mines. This new hushed advance compressed the reaction window to mere seconds, often leaving defenders with no time to adjust. For the Soviet riflemen, huddled in their shallow trenches, the sudden, silent appearance of these tanks was a psychological weapon as potent as any high-explosive shell. The absence of expected sound, the uncanny stillness preceding the visual confirmation, instilled a primal fear that transcended the immediate threat of the steel. It was a violation of the natural order of battle, a phantom assault that undermined their training and their very understanding of warfare. The initial shock of the silent emergence gave way to a dawning, unsettling recognition. The familiar growl of a Maybach HL 230 P30 engine, the clatter of a Panzer IV's interleaved road wheels. These were the auditory signatures of their enemy, deeply ingrained in the Soviet soldiers' combat experience. But the hulking shapes now resolving themselves from the smoke offered no such comfort of recognition. Instead, a profound quietude accompanied their advance, a mechanical stealth that defied every expectation of armored warfare. This absence of sound, more than any visual detail, registered first. A standard German tank, even at a distance, announced its presence with a distinct, almost guttural roar, a complex symphony of internal combustion and grinding steel that carried for kilometers across the open steppes. The T-34 crews, often listening for these telltale signs, relied on them for early warning and tactical positioning. Here, however, the only sounds were the distant crackle of small arms fire and the wind whistling through the ruined landscape. As the smoke thinned further, revealing the distinct silhouettes, the visual confirmation began to align with the auditory anomaly. These were not the angular, often boxy forms of the Panzer III or IV, nor the more imposing but still audibly distinct Panther. The new tanks presented a lower profile, a more rounded turret, and a peculiar, almost seamless integration of hull and superstructure that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light. Their tracks, too, moved with an unnerving smoothness, a stark contrast to the often jerky, percussive motion of their predecessors. Interrogation files from captured German mechanics, later reviewed by Soviet intelligence, would confirm the precise engineering behind this quietude. The integration of advanced rubber-padded road wheels, redesigned suspension systems, and meticulously balanced drivetrains had significantly reduced track noise. Furthermore, the engines, while still powerful, were encased in sound-dampening materials, a design choice prioritizing stealth over raw power output in certain operational profiles. Production logs from Henschel and Porsche factories, dating back to late 1942, indicated a concerted effort to minimize acoustic signatures on their heavier prototypes. The strategic implications of this silent advance were immediate and chilling. The traditional Soviet doctrine of anti-tank defense, heavily reliant on early acoustic detection to prepare ambush sites or coordinate artillery strikes, was fundamentally undermined. A tank that could approach within a few hundred meters before its presence was unequivocally known negated much of the preparatory time that often meant the difference between a successful defense and a catastrophic overrun. The psychological impact on the infantry, who had grown accustomed to the audible warning, was equally profound, replacing a familiar dread with an unnerving uncertainty. The men in the trenches, their earlier jokes about the delay, now a bitter memory, watched the silent behemoths emerge. The quiet was not peace, it was the sound of a new kind of war. Eastern Front, winter 1944. The biting wind carried the scent of pine and spent cordite, a familiar perfume to the men of the 23rd Guards Rifle Division. They had grown accustomed to the grinding cacophony that preceded a panzer assault, the rising growl of Maybach engines, the shriek of tracks on frozen earth, the distant thud of cannon fire. These sounds were a grim herald, a signal to brace, to dig deeper, to prepare for the storm. But this morning, a different kind of silence pressed in, a stillness more unnerving than any barrage. The first reports filtered back from forward observation posts, relayed by field telephone, crackling with static and disbelief. "They're just there," a voice insisted. Out of the smoke, no sound. This lack of auditory warning was a profound tactical disruption. Infantry, conditioned to react to sound cues, found themselves caught flat-footed, their defensive preparations suddenly inadequate against an enemy that materialized rather than announced itself. The psychological impact was immediate and corrosive, eroding morale more effectively than direct fire. A captured German maintenance manual, later translated, detailed the meticulous engineering behind this unexpected quietude. The Maybach HL230 P30 engine, while powerful, was notoriously loud. However, later variants, particularly those fitted to the Königstiger, incorporated advanced exhaust baffling and improved engine compartment insulation. These modifications, often overlooked in the focus on armor thickness or gun caliber, were critical in dampening the acoustic signature, especially at lower speeds and idle. Production logs from Henschel and Porsche factories indicated a gradual integration of these noise reduction measures, beginning in late 1943. Initially, these were minor improvements, but by mid-1944, a dedicated effort was made to reduce the operational sound profile of heavy tanks. This was not a primary design objective, but rather a refinement driven by field reports highlighting the vulnerability of noisy vehicles to ambush and anti-tank teams. The cumulative effect, however, was significant, particularly when coupled with battlefield conditions that favored acoustic masking, such as smoke screens or dense fog. The strategic implication was clear. The element of surprise, a diminishing asset for the Wehrmacht, was partially restored. A silent tank could close distances unobserved, negating the range advantage of many Soviet anti-tank guns and allowing for more precise, devastating initial volleys. This forced Soviet doctrine to adapt, emphasizing constant visual vigilance, improved forward reconnaissance, and the deployment of acoustic sensors. Though these were often unreliable in the chaotic environment of the Eastern Front, the quiet approach also made it harder for artillery spotters to pinpoint tank formations, delaying counter-battery fire and allowing the panzers to consolidate their positions. For the men in the trenches, the silence was a new kind of dread. It meant that the first sign of an approaching heavy tank might be the sudden, terrifying appearance of its massive silhouette, emerging from the haze like an apparition, its 88mm gun already traversing, its tracks churning the earth without a whisper. Eastern Front, late 1943. The low thrum of a distant engine, the clatter of tracks over frozen ground. These were the familiar heralds of armored assault. Soviet infantry, dug into shallow trenches, often found a grim humor in the predictable rhythm of battle. The long wait for the inevitable. A wait that offered a psychological buffer, a chance to brace for impact. This auditory landscape, ingrained through years of brutal conflict, provided a framework for survival, a system of cues that, however terrifying, allowed for a degree of tactical response. The sudden absence of these cues, therefore, was not merely a novelty, but a profound disruption. When the first reports filtered back, fragmented and disbelieving, of tanks appearing without the customary roar, they were often dismissed as battlefield hysteria or the exaggerations of shell-shocked men. A unit diary from the 27th Guards Rifle Division, dated November 1943, records an entry. Sergeant Volkov reports enemy armor appeared from smoke without sound, observation deemed unreliable. This institutional skepticism, however, quickly dissolved in the face of repeated, harrowing encounters. The tactical implications were immediate and devastating. Standard anti-tank doctrine relied heavily on early detection, allowing crews to ready their weapons, to coordinate fire, or to reposition to more advantageous firing lanes. The 45mm anti-tank gun, the ubiquitous 45, required precious seconds to traverse and elevate, its crew exposed during the process. Without the audible warning, these seconds were often lost, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization as the silent steel behemoths materialized from the obscuring smoke or the pre-dawn gloom. The psychological impact on the infantry was equally severe. The human brain, wired for pattern recognition, struggled to process an attack that defied established sensory input. A soldier's internal clock, calibrated to the growing crescendo of an approaching tank, found itself abruptly reset. Fear, a constant companion on the front, intensified when the threat became intangible, appearing as if by magic, a silent predator emerging from the haze. Interrogation files from captured Soviet soldiers frequently mentioned a ghostly quality to these attacks, a sense of unreality that compounded their terror. This silent approach negated the very act of preparation, stripping away the small comforts of anticipation. The brief, shared moments of gallows humor, the whispered curses, the final tightening of a rifle strap, all these rituals of readiness were rendered obsolete. The enemy was no longer a distant rumble on the horizon, but an immediate, unannounced presence, a steel fist materializing from the void. The psychological toll of this new reality was immeasurable, eroding morale with a stealth more insidious than any direct artillery barrage. The shift in the auditory battlefield created a new kind of vulnerability, a chink in the armor of Soviet resolve that no amount of courage or firepower could entirely mend. The silence itself became a weapon, a psychological assault that preceded the physical one, leaving men disoriented and exposed. The familiar world of predictable battle had fractured, replaced by an unnerving quiet that heralded only sudden death. Eastern Front, summer 1944. The acrid scent of burnt cordite still hung heavy in the air, a metallic tang that clung to uniforms and the very earth itself. The initial shock of the silent tanks had passed, replaced by a grim understanding of the new reality. German infantry, once confident in their ability to detect and counter armored thrusts, now moved with a palpable unease, their eyes scanning the smoke-choked fields with a desperate intensity, listening for a sound that would never come. The psychological toll was immediate and profound. Unit after unit reported a marked increase in combat stress reactions, a phenomenon exacerbated by the perceived supernatural quality of the silent approach. Interrogation files from captured German soldiers consistently detailed a sense of dread, a feeling of being hunted by an unseen predator. The absence of engine noise, once a reliable early warning, had become a weapon in itself, eroding morale with every unseen advance. Tactically, the silent tanks forced a radical reevaluation of defensive doctrine. Static anti-tank positions designed to engage targets at range after acoustic detection were now rendered partially obsolete. The Soviet armored spearheads, once heralded by their rumbling approach, now materialized from the obscuring smoke and dust of the battlefield with startling suddenness, often at point-blank range. This compressed reaction time left German defenders scrambling, their heavy anti-tank guns struggling to acquire and track targets that emerged without warning. Damage reports from the weeks following the initial engagements painted a stark picture. German infantry divisions reported significantly higher rates of close-quarters combat losses, particularly in engagements where smoke or low-visibility conditions prevailed. Production logs from Soviet tank factories indicated a sustained focus on the T-34 variant incorporating the experimental electric drive, a clear signal of the high command's satisfaction with its battlefield performance. The perceived invulnerability of these silent machines, even if technically unfounded, amplified their destructive impact as panicked defenders often overreacted or broke formation. The strategic implications rippled across the front. German High Command issued urgent directives emphasizing the need for enhanced forward observation and more aggressive patrolling to counter the silent threat. Yet these measures were often insufficient against an enemy that could close distances with unprecedented stealth. The silent tanks, initially a tactical surprise, had evolved into a strategic lever, forcing the Wehrmacht to commit disproportionate resources to counter a threat that defied conventional detection. The laster of the Soviet infantry, once a gallows humor board of waiting, had been replaced by the quiet, methodical advance of an unseen force, reshaping the very contours of the battlefield with each silent emergence. Moscow, December 1943. The reports from the front lines, compiled and filtered through various echelons, coalesced into a troubling pattern on the desks of Stavka analysts. Initial dispatches, often dismissed as frontline hysteria or exaggeration, spoke of armored assaults materializing with an unnerving absence of the characteristic diesel roar or track clatter. These were not isolated incidents. Unit diaries from the 3rd Guards Tank Army and the 5th Shock Army, specifically from engagements in the lower Dnieper region, detailed multiple occurrences across a 2-week period. The tactical implications were immediate and severe. Standard Soviet defensive doctrine, heavily reliant on auditory cues for early warning and identification of armored thrusts, found itself fundamentally undermined. Anti-tank gun crews, accustomed to the rising crescendo of approaching engines, were caught unprepared, their targeting solutions often still being calculated as the enemy armor closed to point-blank range. Infantry, whose morale was already a fragile commodity in the protracted winter fighting, reported a new, insidious fear of an enemy that could simply appear from the smoke and mist of the battlefield. Interrogation files from captured German personnel, specifically from the 11th Panzer Division and elements of the SS Panzer Corps, offered fragments of explanation. While none directly admitted to silent tanks, several mentioned the increased use of electric drive systems for auxiliary functions and, more significantly, the meticulous maintenance and tuning of engine baffles and exhaust systems. One Obergefreiter, under sustained questioning, recounted how their mechanics worked like devils to ensure the engines ran smooth as a church mouse. This anecdotal evidence, while lacking technical specificity, pointed towards a deliberate German effort. A technical examination of battlefield recoveries provided more concrete, though still incomplete, data. A damaged Panther OSF-A, captured largely intact near Kirovograd, revealed an unexpectedly sophisticated exhaust manifold design. Its multiple internal baffles and ceramic lining, a departure from earlier models, significantly reduced acoustic signatures, particularly at lower RPMs. Damage reports indicated that while these modifications did not render the tank truly silent, they drastically attenuated the sound, especially when combined with the ambient noise of a battlefield. Production logs from the Daimler-Benz and MAN factories obtained through intelligence channels showed a marked increase in orders for specialized acoustic dampening materials and components during the latter half of 1943. While the exact application was not always specified, the timing correlated precisely with the observed battlefield phenomena. This suggested a systemic, rather than ad hoc, implementation of these modifications across newer production batches of German armor, particularly the Panther and later variants of the Panzer IV. The strategic implication was a shift in the calculus of armored warfare. The element of surprise, previously a factor primarily in infantry and cavalry engagements, was now being extended to heavy armor, traditionally the most audible component of a ground assault. This forced a reevaluation of everything from forward observation post protocols to the deployment of mobile anti-tank reserves. The previous reliance on acoustic detection grids, a cornerstone of Soviet deep defense, was rendered largely obsolete against such an adversary. The psychological impact on the Soviet soldier was also profound. The silent tank became a whispered legend, a new bogeyman in the already brutal landscape of the Eastern Front. It was no longer enough to listen. One had to constantly watch, straining eyes through the smoke and snow, knowing that the next armored threat might not announce itself until it was upon them. This pervasive anxiety, documented in countless company-level morale reports, added another layer of attrition to the human cost of the war. The Stavka's recommendation was clear: immediate development of enhanced visual and thermal detection systems for frontline units, coupled with a renewed emphasis on aggressive forward reconnaissance. They also urged accelerated production of anti-tank weaponry capable of engaging targets at extended ranges, before the enemy could exploit their acoustic advantage. The initial reports had been dismissed as folklore. Now, the reality of an enemy capable of deploying silent armored units cast a long, cold shadow across the winter plans. Production figures from the Chelyabinsk tractor plant for the Su-85 self-propelled gun, January 1944, showed a 15% increase in output over the previous month.